When was my house built? How old is it? These are probably the two most common questions I get asked by clients when I'm researching the history of houses. So what I thought I would do in this video is show you how to use the style of your house as a way to estimate when it was built. This is just intended as a very quick introduction to the house styles built in Brisbane and when they were built. It's by no means a comprehensive tutorial. I do plan to do that down the track and go into this in a lot more painful detail, but for now, this is just an introduction. I do have to preface this with the fact that house style is only the very first thing I look at when I'm trying to work out when a house was built, and it is only a very broad guide, and I will go into much more detail of how to work out exactly when your house was built in later videos. So this is intended only as an overall guide to when your house was built. What I'm going to do to make it a bit easier is break this down into four main eras for house construction. Now, this is effectively arbitrary dates. House styles didn't adhere to our calendars and that type of thing, but it will just make it a little bit easier, I think. When trying to determine if your house was built before 1900, the absolute key feature to look at is the roof style and the veranda roof. These are the two elements that are going to tell you the most information. So most houses that were built before 1900 in Brisbane have a separate and lower roof over the front veranda. Oh, and of course, most of the houses have verandas. That's a fairly standard Brisbane and Queensland design. Now, this feature is quite distinctive. Even if the front veranda's been enclosed, you'll normally be able to see that the roof line's still separate and lower. Now, it didn't suddenly get to 1900 and they stopped building these houses, but it gradually became less common after that. So have a look and ask yourself, is the veranda roof lower and separate to the main roof of the house? If the answer is yes, then it's very likely that it predates 1900. Veranda roofs during this period were built in a number of different profiles, and by profiles I mean if you look at the side of the house, what does the shape look like of the veranda roof? So you could have bullnose, where it's flat for a bit and then it just curves on the end. You can have concave, where it's curved down like that, like a U shape. You can have convex, which is probably the most common in Brisbane, where it actually curves up. And you can also just have what's called a skillion roof, where it's just a straight finish. But the key feature is that it's lower and separate from the main part of the building. Then you want to have a look at the main roof over the core of the building. So by core of the building, I mean the main footprint of the living area, so the main part of the house. For the main roof of the house over the core, the most common style was either a pyramid, so it generally had a square-shaped floor plan with a pyramidal roof and quite a steep pitch. So in general as well, the steeper the roof, the older the house is in general. And the transverse gable roof cottage, as it's known. This style of house has, they're very small to start with. They're often only 2 or 4 rooms, and they would have a wide ridge line, and that would be parallel to the street. At either end of the house, there would be a gable. Now, by gable, I mean the triangular shaped bit that's formed by the junction of the 2 different pitches of roof. So they're the 2 main styles, the pyramid roof and the transverse gable roof cottage. Both of these houses, however, have the lower separate veranda roof along the front. Most of the transverse gable cottages were only 2 rooms. They were very small, very basic homes, but some of them were built or later extended to become 4 rooms, and this was basically 2 transverse cottages joined together. So if you look from the side, the single cottage would have a V-shaped roof. If you look at the 4-room version, it has an M-shaped roof line because it's got the 2 inverted V's joined together, if that makes sense. Now, there's a number of other features as well that will indicate that your house was built prior to 1900. Very quickly, these are a brick chimney, external cross bracing, particularly on the front wall of the house, Single skin walls. So by that I mean that there's no cavity between two walls. You've just got a single layer of timber between the inside and the outside of the house. Usually it's what's called VJs, so that stands for vertical joint, and it's a type of tongue and groove board where they fit together and the joint runs vertically, hence vertical joint VJ. Another thing to look for is the windows. So this era housing generally had double hung windows. Now by double hung, I mean that they were counterweighted and there was two panes of windows that slid up and down like that, as opposed to later casement windows which open in and out. These windows generally had two panes on the top panel and two panes on the bottom panel. So if your house has those, you can be, if they're original, there's obviously later reproductions, but if they're original, then generally your house will have been built prior to 1900. Another good way to test if they are the original glass is if you look through the glass and it looks kind of wavy, if things look a bit blurry outside and the glass isn't entirely perfect, it's a good indication that it's got old glass in it, which was manufactured before the process became more perfect and the glass was much more regular later on. So in summary, if your house was built prior to 1900, it should have a veranda roof that's separate and lower to the main roof, a steep main roof that's generally a pyramid, or it has a transverse gable roof. It might have a brick chimney, exposed cross bracing on the external walls or VJ single skin walls, and it is likely to have double hung 2-pane over 2-pane windows. Let's have a look now at how to tell if your house was built between about 1900 and 1920. The key feature to look for here again is the roof line. The biggest change that happened around this period was that the veranda roof that had previously been separate and lower now falls under the main roof of the house. And this style of roof, where it continues in a single unbroken line from the apex down to the edge of the veranda, is called a bungalow roof. So you start to see this style of house known as a bungalow roofed cottage or bungalow roofed house. This isn't to be confused with the later California bungalow style or the Federation bungalows that you see in southern states. They're a slightly different version of this style, and the California bungalow comes in the 20s and 30s in Brisbane, and I'll talk about that later. So bungalow roof is a very popular style. The pitch is slightly lower than it was in the earlier houses. Of course, with these early house styles, there can be a number of different variations in size, in decorative detail, in overall grandeur as well. So you will find these early house styles with a veranda across the front, an L-shaped veranda where it just goes around the front and one side, U-shaped veranda where it goes around 3 sides, or sometimes an encircling veranda where it goes around all 4 sides. Other elements changed over time as well, such as the style of the timber detailing on the veranda, the external wall cladding and things like that. But the key feature to look for is that bungalow roof. It just firmly plants it within about the 1900s to the 1920s, and it is a really good indicator of the age of your house fitting in that period. Now, within the bungalow roof style, there can be a number of variations. You can still have the pyramid shaped roof that was popular in the earlier styles. You can have short ridge roof lines and you can have long ridge roof lines. They all still fall under the bungalow roof category because the roof extends to the edge of the veranda in one unbroken line. Let's move on to the 1920s and 1930s. I mentioned gables previously, and in the earlier house designs they tended to be perpendicular to the street, so on either side of the house. 20s and 30s is the period of the street facing gable. Now, I mentioned California bungalows earlier as well, and these styles in Brisbane and Queensland evolved out of the popularity of the California bungalow. And by California bungalow, I mean the American examples of houses which had really low pitch, wide gables facing the street, often only 1 or 2, and they were characterized by their low squat appearance. And this was often accentuated by the use of big chunky stone masonry pillars on the front veranda. Now, the Queensland and Brisbane interpretation of this style stuck with the traditional timber with the tin roof, but we incorporated these street facing gables. Now in Brisbane you will find single gables, double gables, triple gables, sometimes even quadruple gables. So we just embrace the gables with gusto basically. But as soon as you see a street facing gable, generally you can say, okay, that was built between the 1920s and 1930s. Now the roof over the core of the house can still be pyramid shaped, it can have a short ridge, it can have a long ridge, it can have some ridge lines facing the street, parallel to the street, it can have some ridge lines perpendicular to the street, but the gables facing the street are the key factor you want to look for. Other features to look for in your house that will tell you it was most likely built in the 1920s and 30s is half timber decoration. Now what I mean by this, and I'm particularly referring to the decoration that is in the gable, half timbering is it's also sort of called Tudor or mock Tudor. It's basically you have the flush panel and then you have decorative cover strips in it that form a nice pattern, and they were often picked out in different colors to the background. Another feature to look for is bay windows. They became very commonly incorporated in houses of the 1920s and 1930s. Also look out for cantilevered window shades. Now some buildings in this era will still have the old style window shades, either metal or timber, but the cantilevered, and by that I mean they're flat and they have no brackets supporting them, they just stick straight out from the wall like that. This became really common in houses of the 1920s and 1930s in Brisbane. Other features to look out for are the front stairs. Now these started to have balustrades that were actually stepped in design. This was a really common feature introduced in 1920s and 1930s houses. So have a look if your house has those. Of course, front stairs were something that was really common to change, and the balustrades have often been changed as well. And you know, they could very well be a reproduction if there's no other signs of your house being built in this era. Another way that these houses tried to emulate the California bungalow was that even though they remained high set in many examples, they would cover the stumps with boards along from sometimes from veranda balustrade height all the way to the ground. Now this was meant to emulate the squat masonry piers of the American purist examples of this style. So if your house has these big wide timber clad columns that extend all the way to the ground, then it very well could have been built in the interwar era 1920s to 1930s. So in summary, the key features to keep an eye out for to tell if your house was built in the 1920s or 1930s is street facing gables, either one or more, half timber decoration, particularly in the gables, bay window or more than one bay window, stairs with a stepped balustrade, timber-clad columns that extend from the veranda all the way down to ground level, and cantilevered window shades. Finally, post-war houses. Post-war is a really generic term that generally refers to the period after the Second World War ended in 1944. In architectural terms, it's often used to encompass houses built anywhere from the early 1940s right up until the 1970s. What I'm going to look at today is houses that were built between about 1940 and 1960. The main thing to look for to tell you if your house was built after the Second World War is, does it have a front veranda? After the Second World War, there was a huge shortage of building materials, there was a massive demand for housing, and we needed to be building houses as quickly as possible. The first casualty of this reduced floor space and hence reduced requirement for materials was the front veranda. These houses were all about maximising the practical, livable space inside. So the front veranda was gone. This was like a fussy, detailed, expensive thing that was no longer required. And what you see instead is this is reduced often to a very small entry vestibule or lobby. Now the front facade will often be just a flat facade. You can have sort of a slight projection on one side. You can have what is sometimes known down south as a waterfall front, where you actually have 3 different planes to the front, each one recessed from the first one. Again, the number one feature to look for to work out if your house was built in the post-war era is the roof line. Does it have a hipped roof? Now, by a hipped roof, I mean it has no gables. It's sort of an extended, elongated version of the pyramid roof house, and all the planes of the house, all the planes of the roof of the house are the same pitch. You'll often also start to see tiles making their way in instead of corrugated iron as the cladding on the roof. And you'll also see some asbestos products such as Super 6, which is a corrugated product, but it's got a much wider profile of the troughs and valleys than the corrugated iron does. You'll also see some asbestos tiles come into use and other products like that. So after the roof, you need to have a look at the cladding of the house. They will generally be clad in weatherboard or chamfer board. Now by weatherboard, I mean they're overlapping bits of timber like that. Chamfer board is also overlapping timber, but they have a small chamfer recess cut out of them. They were the most common claddings used in the post-war period. They were also obviously used on earlier houses as well. Post-war houses will generally also be quite austere in appearance. So as I mentioned, they were cutting the cost of these houses and they look quite plain compared to earlier houses. They're not very decorative, they're quite simple box forms in general. In addition to timber board cladding, you also start to see fibro being used as cladding. Now, fibro is short for fibrous asbestos cement sheeting. This was a really innovative product in the post-war era, and it meant that houses could be built really quickly. So if you think about it, instead of lapping individual timber boards over it, the builder puts up the studs, bzz, 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 affixes the fibro sheet. It's done. It's quick. It's easy. Now, we obviously know now that it's got horrendous health impacts, but it was definitely a very popular material in the post-war period. In the post-war era, you also see brick houses appearing much more commonly. Now, there was obviously early examples of brick houses as well, but what to look for in post-war houses is really regular, uniform, mass-produced factory bricks. So that's what you want to look for. But brick generally remained much more expensive and much less popular in Brisbane until well into the 60s and 70s. By the post-war era, windows were almost exclusively casement windows, and by casement I mean they have one fixed point and they pivot out, or in some 60s houses they had the hopper version of casement windows where they actually tilted out from the horizontal plane like that. As you move further and further away into the 60s and 70s, a massive variety of different styles of houses began to be built. So I won't go into these in detail. Some of these were high-end architectural design homes, which were much less common than the more austere post-war styles. I'll actually do a separate video just discussing post-war styles because there was such a huge variation, and they often just get lumped into post-war styles, but there's so much variation that they really need attention to detail as well. So there you have it, a very, very quick high-level introduction to work out when your house was most likely built based on its style. I hope you found it useful. If you have, please click like and subscribe. If you've got any comments or feedback, please leave it below. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. My website is housedetective.com.au. I'll put a link to that and also my socials in the description box. Until next time.